فكلي واشربي وقري عينا فإما ترين من البشر أحدا فقولي إني نذرت للرحمن صوما.
Hello everyone, Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to the Islamic Mary podcast. So for today, we're going to return back to the Surat Maryam, and we've reached the verse 23. And this is arguably the climax of the story. Maryam has now learned that she's going to give birth to the baby Jesus. She's become pregnant, and now she's feeling the pains of the labor and the pregnancy. And she makes this remarkable statement. قالت يا ليتني مت قبل هذا وكنت نسيا منسيا. So here she's saying, oh my God, that alas, I wish I died before this and I was a thing long forgotten. So I remember reading this, and sometimes you read something in scripture or the Qur'an, and it's as if you're reading it for the first time, that you missed reading it and analyzing it in great depth and detail. And when you see Maryam portrayed in the Qur'an, you understand her to be exemplary figure. She's someone that is supposed to be highlighted, praised, emulated. But here she's making a cry. And she's saying that I wish I had died before all of this. And I was a thing that was long forgotten. When I read this, I immediately started thinking, that is this heretical? Is this something that should be emulated? Is this something that the believers, the prophet, the righteous, are they people who say such things? And I started to look into the commentary tradition to better understand this statement. So some commentators here note that wishing death is the habit of the righteous, that if they find themselves in tribulation, then they say such things. In moments of vulnerability, the righteous may lament or desire death. So here we hear Maryam's voice, Ya laytani, that she's wishing and she's desiring. And then the commentator Al-Razi gives an example of the Battle of the Camel, where Ali, the fourth caliph and the cousin of the Prophet Muhammad, would face the army of the wife of the Prophet Muhammad, Aisha. So this was internal civil war. And before the battle, he says, I wish I had died 20 years before this. So Ali wished that he did not have to face off against Aisha and other Muslims, and that he had died long before. Similarly, the Caliph Umar once picked up a straw on the earth and emphasized with it, lamenting, I wish I weren't anything. Rather than being burdened with the power and responsibility of governorship, Umar wished he was nothing. So similar to Ali, he wished he was dead or long gone, and that he was just a straw on the earth. And that the companion Bilal, who was a former slave and called her to prayer, would also exclaim, I wish Bilal's mother did not give birth to him. The statement suggests that if the trial was so overwhelming and painful, then the righteous would sometimes wish they were dead rather than go through the specific ordeal. The various exegetical statements demonstrate that the commentators place Maryam within Muslim and Islamic history of trial and tribulation, and put her on the same level as righteous men, such as companions and caliphs. So we see here that when you look at the commentary tradition, the tafsir, you see that for the most part, the commentators do not condemn Maryam. Do not say she was a woman, that she shouldn't have been complaining, that she should have had more faith in God and gone through the specific task, but rather they are praising her, and they're seeing her call as similar to other calls that companions, the righteous. So Ali is seen as the cousin of the Prophet Muhammad. He's seen as a model exemplar, especially in Shiite Islam, but also within Sunni Islam as well. You see this also with Umar, who is widely celebrated in Sunni Islam as the second caliph, and he developed so many different laws and practices that turn into the various madhahab or Islamic schools of law. And then Bilal, who is a slave, who was from Africa, but converted to Islam, and he later called people to prayer. All of these statements are similar to that of Maryam. It also reveals that the commentators did not condemn her for wishing for death, but rather saw it as a natural part of pain and suffering. And we see that this is a key point in religion and in religious studies, the idea of suffering. What is the point of suffering? Is suffering part of life? Is suffering that should be condemned? Or is suffering only of the unrighteous? So we see here that Maryam is exclaiming, and she's talking about her own pain and suffering, and this is part of life. And we see in other verses in the Qur'an that Maryam is connected to the suffering of others, such as Zechariah, who talks about how he doesn't have a child to live out his legacy, that of Job or Ayub, who is sick, and he feels that God should provide his mercy upon him, and that of Yunus or Jonah, who is in the belly of the whale. We also see that Ibn Kathir, one of the commentators, knows that regarding this statement, that it's permissible for the righteous to wish for death during a trial or a tribulation. So another statement attributed to the Prophet Muhammad in the end of time states, there will come a time when a man passes by a grave of a man and will say, I wish I was in his place. So people would rather be buried in the graves than live out their lives. And this is arguably part of the Lament, or the signs of the Day of Judgment, where people no longer want to live, that the trials and the crises would be so prominent that they wish they were dead. And then Maria de Cake in the study of Qur'an states that Mary's wish to have died before this means that she wished she could have died before the onset of the difficulties she now faced as a woman giving birth to a child alone, without a husband, including both the physical pain of labor and embarrassment about what people would think of her. So I love that statement because she combines the different opinions. So some say that she was in pain because of the labor. Others say that she was by herself and she was worried about shame and dishonoring her people. But there, Professor DeCake combines both of them, and that this idea that she wished she had died and been forgotten was a mixture of all these different feelings she was feeling at the time, whether that be of the pain of giving birth to her first child, that of being alone and isolated, and that of feeling how would her community look upon her when she comes back to them with a young infant. And we see also the echoes. So one of the things I love about the Qur'an, in particular Surat Maryam, is that certain words remind us of different figures. Maryam makes this statement of death, that she wished she had died before all of this. Now the word death is actually used throughout this chapter, and it connects Maryam with other figures. So the first time the word death is used is regarding John the Baptist, or Yahya. وَسَلَامٌ عَلَيْهِ يَوْمَ وُلِدَ وَيَوْمَ يَمُوتُ وَيَوْمَ يُبْعَثُ حَيًّا. So the Qur'an here says that peace is upon the day that Yahya was born, the day that he will die, and the day he will be raised up again. So here Yahya is understood that he will be born just like any child, and just specifically like Isa or Jesus, and that he will die, that eventually he will be martyred, that he will return back to God, but then once again the Yom al-Ba'ath, the day of resurrection, that he will raise up and be alive. And then we also see the word death used to talk about Jesus or Isa, and almost identically the Quran says in Surah Maryam, وَسَلَامُ عَلَيْهِ, that Isa now speaking the first person. So in the previous verse we see Yahya is described as someone who will be born, someone who will die, and someone who will be raised up again. But in this particular verse, verse 33, we see that Isa is speaking as an infant. And it says, peace upon me, the day that I was born, the day that I will die, amutu wa yawma ubathu hayya, and the day that I will be resurrected. So once again, the words of death connects Maryam with that of John, of Yahya, that he will be someone who will be raised up, and also that of Isa, her son. Her son actually uses the same verb, that he will die and that he will be raised up again. And we see here also towards the end of the chapter. So oftentimes people focus on the beginning of chapter Maryam, the first third or first half, which talks about the story of Zechariah, Maryam, and that of Ibrahim and some of the other prophets. But we see that the second half of the chapter Maryam is also connected to the first half. And later in the chapter, we see وَيَقُولُ الْإِنسَانِ, that the humanity or a particular person will say, وَيَقُولُ الْإِنسَانُ أَإِذَا مَا مِتُّ لَسَوْفَ أَخْرَجُ حَيًّا. So here they say, am I going to die and then I'll be resurrected again, alive, حَيًّا? And we see here the exact same form of the verb is used, mittu. So as we recall, that Maryam, she laments and she says mittu qabla hada, and in the same way we see that this person, this figurative person, says, if I die, will I actually be resurrected again? So this idea of death and resurrection is part of the chapter, and her statement that I wish I had died before all this eventually leads, as we'll see, to the birth of Jesus, of Isa. So there's this remarkable connection between life and death we see throughout the Qur'an, that some verses say خَلَقَ الْمَوْتَ وَالْحَيَاةَ, that God created the idea of death and life. And at the same time, we see that when death is mentioned in this specific chapter, then we have the idea of life and resurrection. That when Yahya is described as someone who will die, then right afterwards it mentions that he will be resurrected alive. And then once after Isa or Jesus, he says that he will die, then right afterwards this idea of he will be resurrected alive. And then later in the chapter, this idea that a person may question that, hey, how is it possible that I would die and then eventually I'll be resurrected alive? And then the Quran answers that this is part of God's revelation and message that humanity will return back to him. So in conclusion, we see that the second half of verse 23 in the chapter Maryam emphasizes the idea of lament. That Maryam is saying, Ya laytani, I wish I had died before this. And this is something that we find throughout the Qur'an. The various figures are lamenting, whether that be of Zechariah or that of Jonah, Yunus, or that of Ayub, Job, that they're facing a certain tribulation, a trial, and they go and they speak to God. Now, in this lament, many of the scholars, they do not condemn these figures, that they're saying that part of speaking to God and complaining to him is actually an attribute of the righteous. It shouldn't be something prohibited, that someone feels so close and intimate with God that they speak about their pain and their suffering. And we see here also the idea of accepting the struggle, that they see Maryam as not refuting or rejecting God's will. God sent an angel, and that angel breathed into her, and she became pregnant with Jesus. But in this moment of pain, she's expressing herself, not saying, God, I didn't want to have this wonderful child. And we also see the theme of death, that throughout this chapter, there are moments where certain figures feel that they're about to die. As we recall early on, Zechariah, he feels his age, that his hair is all white, his bones have become fragile. He's at the door of death. And at this moment, he laments. He speaks to God and says, God, I would like to have a child to live out my legacy. And we see the opposite with that of Maryam. That Maryam is a young woman, but she's going through this remarkable trial and tribulation of having birth, having a child for the first time, alone, isolated, and potentially within a context where she'll be condemned and shamed. But in this moment where she feels the idea of death and passing away, life emerges. And that will be, as we'll see in future episodes, that avalisa of Jesus, that in this moment of pain and suffering, hope emerges. So thanks once again for listening to the Islamic Mary podcast. I would encourage you to subscribe, encourage your friends, students, and colleagues to listen to the podcast. Also, you feel free to text me your thoughts, your ideas. You can also send me an email. I would love it if you review this podcast and give your feedback. I'm really happy that we have over several 5-star ratings. And you're welcome to visit my website and join my newsletter, where I'll be updating folks on the publication of the Islamic Mary. I'm super excited to share that the book is now available for pre-order. So you can order that book, and it should be coming out on September 9th. Thanks once again, and take care.